October 1963. Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana. The air at 5 in the morning smelled of damp clay and something else, something sweet and rotten underneath, the way fruit smells when it has turned past saving. Harlan Dupree, 61 years old, walked the perimeter of his tobacco field the way he had walked it for 38 years, pressing 2 fingers into the soil every 20 paces and reading what came up on his skin. He had done this since his father showed him how in 1925, and he had never once needed to be told twice. He owned 190 acres along Cane River, 140 of which ran in tight, irrigated rows of burley tobacco. The land carried a $47,000 lien from First National Bank of Alexandria, taken out in 1959 to put in a second irrigation channel. The 1963 crop was supposed to retire $9,000 of that note. He had 4 buyers scheduled for the first week of November. His wife, Marguerite, kept the ledger. They had not missed a payment in 4 years. That morning, his fingers came up black, not the dark brown of healthy Natchitoches clay. Black, slick, with a faint lavender tinge in the crease of his knuckle. He stood there in the gray pre-dawn light and held his hand up and looked at it for a long time. Then, he walked to the next row. Same result. He walked the entire eastern half of the field, 70 acres, before the sun fully cleared the tree line. Every test the same. He crouched down in row 47 and pulled a stalk at the base. The root system came up covered in a dense gray mat of mycelium, fine as spider silk, wrapped so tightly around the root mass that it pulled the surrounding soil with it in a solid clump. Harlan set the clump down and sat on his heels and looked at it. He understood, without needing to say it out loud, that the 1963 crop was gone. If you are watching this for the first time, consider subscribing. This channel covers stories like this one every week. The county extension agent, a man named Gerald Trosclair, drove out from Natchitoches 2 days later in a green 1961 Ford F-100 and spent 45 minutes walking the field. He collected 3 soil samples in glass jars, held each one up to the light, shook his head, and capped them. He told Harlan it appeared to be a Phytophthora variant, possibly Phytophthora nicotianae. Black shank disease, though the mycelial mat was heavier than anything he had personally observed in burley tobacco. He said the eastern field was a total loss. He said the western 70 acres might be saved if Harlan applied a copper-based fungicide within the week, though, given the moisture content of the soil and the late-season timing, he gave that even odds at best. Harlan asked him what he recommended for the following year. Trosclair told him he should probably rotate out of tobacco for 2 full seasons. Let the field lie fallow, or put in soybeans. He said the Phytophthora inoculum in the soil could persist for up to 4 years in the right conditions. He said he was sorry. Harlan nodded. He did not tell Trosclair what he was already calculating, $9,000 missed on the November payment, a bank that had shown no patience during the 1960 dry season, and a second irrigation channel that had cost $14,000 to install and now served a field that could not be planted for 2 years. He shook Trosclair's hand and watched the green Ford disappear down the parish road, then drove to Alexandria to see the loan officer at First National. The loan officer's name was Davis Fontenot. He had been behind that desk for 11 years. He told Harlan that the bank could not restructure the note based on weather events or crop disease. Those were risks the borrower assumed at signing. He said the November payment would still be due. He said he was sorry, too. He turned a pen over in his fingers while he said it. Harlan asked if there was any flexibility given the infrastructure investment in the irrigation system, which now represented a permanent improvement to the land's value. Fontenot said the collateral was already factored into the original note. He said the bank's position had not changed. Harlan left the bank and sat in his truck, a 1958 Chevrolet Apache, dark red, with a cracked passenger side mirror he had never replaced, and added the numbers on the back of a deposit slip. Without the tobacco revenue, he would be $9,000 short in November. He had $4,200 in the farm account. He had a tractor, a 1954 Farmhouse Super M in the original red, worth perhaps $1,800 on the open market. And he would not sell it. He had the land. That was what he had. That afternoon he called his daughter in Shreveport and told her not to worry. She told him she would come home that weekend. He told her not to. She came anyway. The ruined eastern field sat untouched through October. Harlan did not disc it or attempt to remediate it. He walked it every morning the way he had always walked it, pressing his fingers into the soil, reading the texture and the moisture and the color of what came up. He was looking for something, though he did not yet know what. In the third week of October, on a gray, wet Thursday, his fingers came up with the mycelial mat again, but this time embedded in the mat, just beneath the surface, was a small brown mass the size and color of a walnut. He dug it out with his pocket knife and sat on the edge of the furrow and turned it over in his hands. He had seen something like it before, not in Louisiana, in France, during the war. He had been billeted for 6 weeks in the Périgord Noir region of the Dordogne, southwest France, in the winter of 1944. A farmer named Auguste Courbet had fed his unit from his own cellar for 3 nights. On the second night, Auguste had shaved a small black lump over scrambled eggs and told Harlan, through a translator, that what he was eating had cost more per pound than beef. It had smelled like the earth and something beyond the earth. Standing in the Natchitoches field in October 1963, Harlan looked at the brown lump in his palm and understood, in a way that was more physical than intellectual, that the Phytophthora fungus had not killed his tobacco field so much as it had changed the soil conditions in a way that allowed something else to grow. The mycelial mat, dense, moisture-retaining, acidic, had created a microenvironment that the existing root structure of a stand of native oak along the eastern fence line had apparently colonized. The brown mass in his hand was not a tumor. It was a tuber. Specifically, it was what appeared to be a tuber gibbosum, the Oregon black truffle, or possibly a related North American variant he could not immediately name. He put it in his shirt pocket and finished his walk. He did not tell Marguerite what he had found. He went to the Natchitoches Parish Library the following morning and sat for 3 hours with the reference volumes on mycology. What he learned confirmed what he had sensed. Certain truffle varieties formed obligate mycorrhizal relationships with host tree roots. The dense, disturbed fungal environment his ruined tobacco field had created had not been a cause of the truffle growth, it had been a coincidence of conditions. The soil pH had dropped, the moisture retention had increased, the tobacco root mass had died and created organic matter in the topsoil. And the oak stand along the fence line had apparently hosted a truffle population that had never had access to those conditions before. The literature was sparse on American truffle cultivation. There were references to Italian tuber melanosporum cultivation trials and a single 1959 paper from Oregon State University documenting naturally occurring black truffle fruiting bodies in the Willamette Valley. But the more useful document was older. In the back of a 1931 USTA extension bulletin on soil fungal ecology, a publication the library had in its archive, there was a footnote from a French-born extension consultant named Jacques Miret. The footnote read, "Inoculation of host root systems with truffle spore material under controlled pH conditions, 5.56.2, has produced fruiting bodies within 36-48 months in southern France. American oak species have not been systematically tested. 36 months. That was a long time. But it was not longer than the 2 years his field would be fallow anyway. Harlan drove back to the farm, pulled the brown lump from his shirt pocket, and set it on the kitchen windowsill above the sink. He began in November 1963, while the rest of the country sat in front of televisions, watching the news from Dallas. He worked alone, in the early mornings, before the light was fully up. He started with the oak stand, 9 trees, white oak and water oak mixed, running 180 feet along the eastern fence line. He identified the natural truffle fruiting zone by walking it on his hands and knees, pressing a thin metal rod, a piece of 1/4-inch rebar, cut to 14 inches, into the soil at 6-inch intervals along the root drip line of each tree. The soil at the productive depth, 7 to 9 inches down, had a specific texture, almost greasy, with a faint resistance that compacted rather than broke when the rod withdrew. He flagged each productive site with a short piece of surveyor's tape tied to a fence staple pressed into the ground. By mid-November, he had mapped 23 productive sites under 6 of the 9 trees. He harvested each one carefully, using a narrow-bladed garden trowel and a piece of burlap to wrap the specimens. The largest was roughly the size of a golf ball. The smallest, the size of a large marble. He cleaned them in the kitchen after Marguerite had gone to bed. He weighed them on the kitchen scale, 1.4 pounds total, across all 23 specimens. He set aside 6 of the best specimens for spore propagation, following the method he had inferred from the 1931 Oosta Bulletin and a technique he improvised from his own reading. He dissolved the specimens in a bucket of well water and aged oak leaf mulch, let the slurry sit for 4 days, then applied it to the root zones of all 9 oak trees along the fence line, working the inoculant into the soil at the 7-inch depth with a narrow hand auger he had fitted with a stop collar to prevent overpenetration. He did this 4 times over the winter of 1963-1964. He told no one what he was doing. When his neighbor, Cliff Arsenault, asked him in December why he was spending so much time at the fence line instead of prepping the western field for the spring soybean rotation, Harlan said he was checking drainage. Arsenault nodded and drove on. In February 1964, Harlan drove the 17 remaining truffle specimens to New Orleans. He had made one phone call beforehand to the Pontchartrain Hotel on St. Charles Avenue and asked to speak to the chef. The chef, a man named Renaud Beaumont, had trained in Lyon before coming to New Orleans in 1951. Harlan did not tell him what he was bringing. He said he had something Beaumont might find interesting. He set the burlap parcel on the stainless steel prep counter of the Pontchartrain kitchen. Beaumont unwrapped it. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he picked up the largest specimen, held it to his nose, and closed his eyes. He said, "Where did these come from?" Harlan told him Louisiana. Beaumont said that was not possible. Harlan said it was. Beaumont weighed the specimens on a kitchen scale. He offered Harlan $18 a pound. Harlan looked at the scale and looked at Beaumont and said he would take $22. Beaumont studied him for a moment and agreed. The 17 specimens weighed just under 1 pound. Harlan drove home with $21.50 in his pocket and a commitment from Beaumont to take everything Harlan could bring him the following season. The November 1963 bank payment was 90 days late when Harlan negotiated a partial deferral through an agricultural hardship provision he found in his original loan documents, a clause Fontenot had not mentioned in their October meeting. He made a partial payment of $3,800 in February 1964, the same week he returned from New Orleans. The deferral kept the note from defaulting. It was not comfortable, but it held. Meanwhile, Harlan had written a formal letter to the State Agricultural Commissioner's office in Baton Rouge in November 1963, documenting the timeline of Trosclair's site visit, the extension agent's recommendations, and what Harlan described as the absence of any communication regarding the known risk of Phytophthora persistence in rotational tobacco plots irrigated through shared drainage channels. He had asked a Natchitoches attorney named Everett Boudreau to look at the letter before sending it. Boudreau suggested 2 additions and charged Harlan $35 for the consultation. The letter went out certified mail in December. The state commissioner's office did not respond until April 1964. When they did, it was a form letter. Harlan filed it and wrote again, this time requesting the Extension Service's internal protocols for reporting fungal contamination risk in tobacco plots that shared irrigation infrastructure with neighboring operations. He would wait. If this story is holding your attention, the subscribe button costs nothing and helps this channel continue producing work like this. The spring of 1964 brought a problem Harlan had not anticipated. The inoculant applications over the winter had been too effective. New fruiting bodies began appearing not just along the oak fence line, but in a 30-foot radius around 3 of the 9 trees, extending into what had been the tobacco field margin. The soil in those areas had apparently retained the Phytophthora mycelial mat at a depth sufficient to create a nearly ideal pH zone. But the new growth was inconsistent. Some specimens were well-formed, firm, with the dense, layered internal structure he had seen in the USDA bulletin photographs. Others were soft, malformed, with a spongy interior that Beaumont, on a follow-up call, described as commercially unusable. Harlan identified the difference within a week. The malformed specimens had formed at a depth shallower than 5 inches, where soil temperature fluctuations were too variable. The productive zone was tightly bounded, 7 to 9 inches, consistent moisture, stable temperature. Anything outside that band produced inferior fruit. He redesigned his harvest grid. He fabricated a new probing tool from a piece of half-inch conduit, fitted with a depth gauge he welded from a washer and a cotter pin, calibrated to stop at 8 inches. He reflagged every productive site. He spent 3 weeks in May 1964 working systematically through the expanded zone, mapping 61 new sites and discarding 14 that fell outside the depth profile. His neighbor Arsenault watched him from the fence line one morning. Arsenault said, "Harlan, what in the Lord's name are you doing with that pipe?" Harlan said, "Soil sampling." Arsenault stood there a while longer. Then he went back to his truck. At the feed store in Natchitoches that June, Roy Thibodeau, who ran 80 acres of cotton on the west side of Cane River, told 2 other men that Harlan Dupree had lost his mind along with his tobacco crop, that he was down on his hands and knees in a ruined field with a piece of metal pipe, and that the bank was going to take the Dupree place before Christmas. Harlan was standing at the counter, paying for a bag of mineral supplement, when Thibodeau said it. He paid, picked up his bag, nodded to the men, and left. He did not address it. He got in the red Apache and drove home and ate supper and went back out to the field before the light was fully gone. By July 1964, he had 94 mapped sites under 8 of the 9 trees. He had harvested and sold 2 more small deliveries to Beaumont, 3 pounds total, at $22 per pound, generating $66, which he put entirely toward the banknote. He had also, quietly, begun communicating with a restaurant buyer in Baton Rouge, who had heard from Beaumont that someone in Natchitoches was producing fresh domestic truffles. The Baton Rouge buyer's name was Claude Theriot. He represented 3 fine dining establishments on Government Street. He asked Harlan if he could supply 3 to 5 pounds per harvest cycle. Harlan told him, not yet. Theriot asked when. Harlan said he would call him. That fall, the inoculant cycle he had started the previous November completed its second full rotation. The harvest yield in October 1964 was 9.4 pounds. He stood in the kitchen at the scale and looked at the number for a long time. Then he called Beaumont and told him he had a delivery. Beaumont said, "How much?" Harlan said, 7 pounds for you. I have another buyer now." The line was quiet for a moment. Beaumont said, "How much are you charging the other buyer?" Harlan said, $28 a pound. Beaumont said he would take $26. Harlan said yes. The state commissioner's office in Baton Rouge sent a second letter in September 1964, not a form letter this time. It acknowledged Harlan's inquiry regarding Extension Service notification protocols, stated that an internal review had found that documentation of fungal contamination risk associated with shared irrigation infrastructure had not been systematically communicated to affected plot operators in Natchitoches Parish, and indicated that the Extension Service would be revising its pre-season advisory protocol for tobacco growers in parishes with known Phytophthora pressure zones. The letter was signed by the Deputy Commissioner. It did not mention Harlan's loss directly. It did not offer compensation. But it was in writing. Boudreaux, when Harlan showed it to him, said it was about as much as a man was going to get from the state without a lawsuit, and that a lawsuit would cost more than it would return. Harlan agreed. He filed the letter with the original certified mail receipt. Gerald Trosclair, the extension agent, revised his preseason advisory for 1965 to include a section on shared irrigation fungal risk assessment. The revised form required growers to document shared drainage points and receive written acknowledgement of contamination risk before the irrigation system was certified for the season. It was a change made in writing, published in the Parish Extension Bulletin, and attributed in that bulletin to recommendations arising from the 1963 Cane River District Review. Trosclair knew whose land that review had started on. He drove out to the Dupree place in the spring of 1965 and stood at the fence line of the oak grove and looked at the flagged survey markers in the soil. He said, "Is that what I think it is?" Harlan said, "Depends on what you think it is." Trosclair crouched down and pressed his fingers into the soil. He looked at what came up. He said, "You found a truffle bed." Harlan said, "I made one." Trosclair stood up and looked at the oak trees and looked at Harlan and said, "I should have told you about the shared drainage risk before the season. I knew about the contamination in the Arsenault field next door." Harlan said nothing. Trosclair said, "I'm sorry, Harlan. I should have told you." Harlan looked at the trees. He said, "The advisory form you put out this spring, the one with the shared drainage section. That's the right thing." They stood there. A red-tailed hawk crossed the field from the south, low and slow, and disappeared into the oak canopy. Trosclair drove back to town. Harlan went back to work. The October 1965 harvest yielded 21 pounds from the expanded grove. Harlan supplied Beaumont at $26 a pound, Thériault's 3 Baton Rouge restaurants at $28, and a new account, a hotel dining room in New Orleans' French Quarter, introduced through Beaumont at $27. Total revenue from that single harvest, $561. He paid the banknote current through the following spring. He did not pay it off. There was still $31,000 outstanding, but he had not missed a payment in 8 months, and the farm was no longer in any danger of foreclosure. He told Marguerite the #1 evening after supper. She set down her coffee cup and looked at the figure on the ledger page for a moment. She said, "From one fence line." He said, "So far." Word moved the way it moved in small parishes, through the back ends of conversations, through the women's side at church, through the front of the feed store after Harlan had left. Roy Thibodeau heard the number from his wife, who had heard it from Marguerite's cousin. Thibodeau drove out to the Dupree place on a Saturday morning in November 1965. He stood at the gate of the oak grove in his good boots and looked at the flagged sites in the earth and the rows of oak trees and the 1954 Farmhouse parked near the fence line. He said, "I heard you're making money off this field." Harlan said, "Some." Thibodeau said, "Off mushrooms." Harlan said, "Truffles." Thibodeau said, "I heard $500 from one picking." Harlan leaned on the gate and did not confirm or deny the number. Thibodeau looked at the ground. He said, "I told people at the feed store you'd lost your mind." Harlan said, "You did." Thibodeau stood there for a while in his good boots, the November mud working at the edges of the leather. He said, "I was wrong about that." Harlan said, "You were." He pushed off the gate and walked back toward the trees. By 1966, Claude Thériault in Baton Rouge had spoken to a purchasing coordinator at Commander's Palace in New Orleans about the domestic truffle supply. Commander's Palace placed an order. Harlan could not fill it entirely. He was producing between 18 and 24 pounds per season, but he filled what he could and told them he would have more the following year. He had begun inoculating a second oak stand on the western boundary of the property, 12 trees, using a refined version of the original slurry technique, this time incorporating a measured soil acidification. Step 1 pound of elemental sulfur per 40 square feet, worked to a depth of 9 inches 6 weeks before inoculation that pushed the pH into the 5.8 range more reliably than the original Phytophthora residue had done. He had worked the acidification timing out himself over 2 seasons of trial, using the pH test strips he bought at the agricultural co-op and a paper journal, where he recorded every site's depth, moisture reading, pH value, and eventual yield. The journal was a standard composition book, black and white cover, the kind sold in every dime store in Louisiana. He kept it in the cab of the Apache, which he had never been without in 16 years. In the spring of 1967, Gerald Trusclair brought a mycologist from Louisiana State University's Ag Center to the Dupree property. The mycologist's name was Dr. Richard Fonvielle. He spent 4 hours on the property and took soil cores from 11 sites. He identified the primary fruiting species as Tuber leoni, the American Périgord truffle, a native species with a flavor profile that French-trained chefs had begun to rank alongside the European varieties. Fonvielle told Harlan that what he had created was, to his knowledge, the first intentionally managed truffle orchard in the state of Louisiana and possibly in the American South. He asked Harlan if he would be willing to share his inoculation and soil preparation methods with the Ag Center for a published study. Harlan said he would share the methods. He would not sign anything that gave the university ownership of the technique or his field data. Fonvielle agreed. The paper, published in the Louisiana Agriculture Journal in 1968, documented the full methodology, soil acidification protocol, inoculant preparation method, depth profiling technique, and multi-season yield data. The paper cited Harlan Dupree of Natchitoches Parish as the originating practitioner. Fonvielle listed himself as the secondary author. 3 farms in Mississippi and 1 in East Texas attempted the method within 2 years of publication. 2 of the Mississippi operations produced viable yields by 1971. The East Texas operation failed due to insufficient drainage, which Fonvielle's 1969 follow-up paper identified as the limiting variable and corrected with a drainage tile specification. The knowledge traveled downstream. It found people who had never heard the name Dupree, who applied the method in their own soil and their own conditions, and produced something from ground that had previously yielded nothing. They did not know its origin. They knew only that it worked. If you have found this useful, consider subscribing. This channel releases new documentary-style research each week. Harlan Dupree continued farming the Cane River land until 1981, when he transferred operations to his son, Marcel, who had worked the truffle grove every harvest season since 1965 and had added a 3rd oak stand along the northern fence line in 1974. By 1981, the 3 groves, together 30 productive trees across 190 feet of fence line, yielded between 60 and 80 pounds per season. Harlan had paid off the first national note in 1972, 9 years early. He kept the 1954 Farmhouse Super M. It ran on a maintenance schedule Harlan had documented in a second composition book: oil change every 50 hours of operation, magneto inspection every spring, carburetor cleaning every fall, tire pressure check before every season's first use. The tractor had been overhauled once, in 1969, at a shop in Natchitoches. Valves reseated. Head gasket replaced at a cost of $340. It needed nothing else. It ran when Marcel needed it to run. Marcel's daughter Clesty was 12 years old in 1981 when her grandfather walked her through the oak grove on a November morning, the air cold and still, the soil soft under their feet. He showed her the depth probe, the conduit piece with the welded stop collar, and showed her how to press it into the ground and feel the resistance change at the productive layer. He showed her how to read the moisture content by the way the soil held its shape when compressed in the palm of the hand. He showed her the composition book and the columns of numbers, the pH readings and moisture values and yield figures going back to 1963. She asked him why the stop collar was set at 8 inches instead of 7 or 9. He said because he had tried 7 and 9, and 8 was where the fruit was. She asked him if it would always be 8 inches. He said no. He said the depth shifted slightly with rainfall patterns, with soil compaction, with the age of the root systems. He said the collar was a starting point. He said she would have to read the soil herself and adjust. He said the instrument told you where to look. It did not tell you what was there. She pressed the probe into the ground at a flagged site and felt the resistance change under her hand, 7 inches down, then 8, then gone. She looked up at him. He said, "Pull it out. Put your finger in the hole." She did. She felt the slightly greasy resistance at depth that she would spend the next 4 decades learning to read correctly. She said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Something is there." The grove still stands along the Cane River fence line. The oak trees are more than 60 years old now. The 3 composition books, Harlan's original field journal, a 2nd volume on equipment maintenance, and a 3rd Marcel, started in 1974, sit in a fireproof box in the farmhouse office. The Farmall Super M is in the equipment shed, red as it ever was, its carburetor clean, its magneto inspected each spring. It will start when Klest needs it to start. The 1963 harvest, the one the Phytophthora fungus erased, was valued at $9,000. The 1965 truffle harvest alone returned $561. By 1972, annual truffle revenue had replaced the tobacco income entirely. What the fungus destroyed was the crop. What it did not destroy, what it could not touch, was the attention with which Harlan Dupree read the ground under his feet. He had walked that ground for 38 years before the October morning he pressed his fingers into the soil, and they came up black. He knew every layer, every seasonal shift, every variance in drainage and texture and smell. He knew it well enough to recognize, in a substance that had killed his livelihood, the conditions for something he had tasted once in France in the winter of 1944 and never forgotten. The fungus did not give him the knowledge. It gave him the ground. He already had everything else. If this story reached you, subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting.